right. So thanks for taking the time today, Michael. And I just want to quickly say I'm a really big fan of your work. For the audience watching this, can you give a really quick primer on who you are and what you do?
I'm an Emeritus Professor at University of New South Wales. Nice Latin term for has been. I've spent about 40 to 50 years in academia, mainly researching workplace health and safety, and taught it. And I also did government inquiry, worked at Pike River. I did a big report on trucking safety in 2000. So worked in that space a fair bit as well.
Now this wasn't your work, but I saw a presentation referencing your work based in Western Australian mining, and it highlighted how workers rated their employers fairly well on some areas, yet fatality analysis still finds multiple pathways present. So I'm wondering, why do organizations sort of feel safe, feel effective, but still fail catastrophically? And how should leaders reconcile this gap?
I think you're talking about the work of Tanya Yenke, and they were surveys. First thing was there was a bias towards management in those surveys. So, of course, the systems, when they looked at health and safety reps in the surveys, they had a far less sanguine view of the systems in those workplaces. And even taking that aside, what they found over time, they did about 4 or 5 of these surveys, was there wasn't a lot of net improvement over time. So the same failure points, but often the areas that management rate better than they probably should, like risk assessment. So these are the people involved in safety. So of course, they in large means think the systems they're using are working. But what was also interesting about that was they all understood the 10 pathways and they all found them of use in sort of evaluating their systems. One mine was using it as a self-audit tool.
And for those following at home, I'll show the 10 pathways on the screen and Michael's work referring to them. Now, auditing keeps showing up as a weak point in benchmarking and case studies around major accidents. And you found it in your research too around the 10 pathways. What do you think makes an audit effective versus a cosmetic or paper checking system? And what should be non-negotiables in these high hazard audits?
Well, I think one of the problems is the quality of the auditor. You need somebody with really independence and a good background, and they need to ask hard questions, and they need to go beyond the paperwork and actually see what's happening in practice. They need to talk to workers. They need to walk around the site. Good auditors will do that, but it's amazing how long-term failures get missed, like a flaw in the contractor management system. One of the advantages of 10 pathways is you can use it as an audit tool, a self-audit tool, and it forces you to ask questions you mightn't otherwise ask. And so, as I said, one mine I was aware of was using it as a self-audit tool. We've also used it for analysing incidents, like high potential incidents. So when an incident is reported in the mine, that's not just a safety incident, but a health incident, dust or something like that. They can actually use, I've got a thing I prepared, which is a single piece of paper where you just fill out, was there a maintenance design or engineering flaw? Were there warning signals? All those points go down. And we've administered that to lots of people in the mining industry who'd like to do it elsewhere. And so far, I've got some very good responses to that. I think I guess the point I'd make is that 10 pathways are the types of failure that have repeatedly led to death and serious injury in the workplace. These are the failures, the latent failures that will lead to serious injury. And so auditors should really trained in these areas and also use these when they go into their whatever workplace, dream world or whatever.
And this wasn't as part of my prior questions, but I'm really interested around this is we mostly have data when things go catastrophically wrong. Like you don't get a royal commission when things don't blow up. I'm wondering about your 10 pathways though. Would you expect to find most of these factors in organizations that aren't having really bad problems? So these are things that we'll find in successful companies too, but when you have more of these factors more of the time, they're more likely to lead to catastrophe, do you think?
I mean, very few organisations would have none of these failures, but it's something to aim for. So it isn't just, I mean, people try to learn from positive lessons, but that's very hard because the companies that they often look at may not be representative of what they can do. So, for instance, they talk about high reliability organisations in the mining industry. It's completely inappropriate for the mining industry because high reliability organisations were based on the nuclear industry, which had a stable market, stable technology, stable workforce, and none of those apply in mining. So Queensland's doing that right now. I think it's very short-sighted. So we need to learn from failure, and so we have. One of the reasons we've got better is we have learned from failure, not as fast or as well as we should have. So those are the sorts of things that we should be doing. But yes, organisations will have, but the very catastrophic disasters, they will have virtually all the pathways there. Pike River had all 10. Dreamworld had 9, if not all 10. But also there's an interesting thing in that, and that is the more thorough the investigation, and with a major catastrophe, you tend to get a more thorough investigation, the more pathways you find. So often it's a matter of which questions you ask. And when you use official records, they often don't ask questions like, were workers feeling unsafe prior to the event? So those sort of aspects are not investigated. So that's one that's typically not asked.
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful response too. And just very quickly, one of my studies looked at thousands of action reports to look at how they discussed the audit's role. And I only found a few dozen out of thousands of reports that actually discussed audits. So it leaves you with the open question where audits just really bastions of excellence that weren't involved, or did we just not explore their role? Yeah, it was.
I think, yeah, in every high hazard industry, I think 10 pathways should be used as a training module because it explains how things can go wrong. And that I think auditors should also be made aware of those things because to do their job properly, they need to be aware of where things can go catastrophically wrong and how a series of failures that may not be very apparent, except in retrospect, when you go back to look at them, they're very apparent.
Yeah.
And so they're there. They're in plain sight, but people are not looking. And they need to see the combinations of failures. For example, if a firm or an organisation is trying to cut costs or it's under production pressure, then other things may get compromised. Engineering decisions, maintenance decisions, risk assessment decisions, so that one failure can start to affect other failures, and you can also have multiple failures under the same category. Like you might design, as you know, the first failure is design, engineering, and maintenance. Well, that may not be just one. You may have 3 failures in that one area. And of course, the more failures you've got in one area, the more likely you are to have a serious event.
Your work highlights how economic or production pressures can corrode our safety systems and controls. What are some of the most practical ways to service and measure these production pressures?
You have to make them explicit. Classic case, you go to the mine or the workplace, management says safety trumps production, but you go to the shop floor, it's not the same. If you're in an organisation and you keep rabbiting on that the firm might close, that's going to affect people's decision making. So by it's a difficult one in the sense that management doesn't want to talk about it, but it's only when it's out in the open that you can get to do with it. And firms can manage even in situations of economic stringency, but that has to be very core to it. They have to deal with it and recognize it. So, and it's the nature of our system that if some people will be, it's not in the mining industry and in other industries, it's not the KPIs of the workers that may be the problem. Bonuses can be a problem, but management are on bonuses. And if you put them on bonuses, guess what's going to be the key priority unless you've got very good safety indices built into those priorities, and they have to be good because people can get their way around them and make them look good on paper, even though, I mean, going back to the one about why routine injury is not a good indicator, well, because it doesn't deal with the catastrophic problems. And one mine that blew up in Queensland, if you looked at its lost time injury frequency rates prior to that, it looked like one of the safest mines in Queensland.
Yeah. Some evidence links contracting arrangements to worsening safety performance, and there's various factors like pressure, disorganization, and interface failures. I'm wondering what separates, do you think, is there a tipping point where these contracting arrangements, you think, shift to being higher sources of risk or amplifiers of risk? And what decision rules should leaders use to kind of avoid that?
Okay, there's a lot in that. Contracting and piecework are quite similar because people are rewarded for the amount of work they do. So there's always an incentive to get a job finished as quickly as possible, because the more work you can do, the more pay you make. Now, trucking, a lot of the drivers are paid by kilometre rates. So, and their rates are not very good because of the pressure of the commercial pressures of the major clients of the trucking industry. And that's driven down rates, and that encourages unsafe practices and fatigue and things like that. So they are contractors, but there's a very wide body of literature going back over 100 years saying that people paid under incentive piecework systems, their health and safety outcomes, including psychosocial, are worse than for people not paid on those rates. That's one of the reasons the new IR regime has been brought in to enable the set minimum rates for gig workers and for truck drivers, and that's because they know there's a direct connection between pay and safety. Now, lots of people want to deny this, but as I said, there's a bucket load of evidence going back over a century pointing to these connections. There's another one about the people. We don't want to talk about the economic safety connection, and because it's not comfortable. Well, it's there. Disorganized, there is, and now coming to your tipping point, the more contractors you have on a work site, the more potential for disorganization, for breakdowns of information flows, and intense competition occasionally between contractors, and therefore the more potential for serious events to occur. And also, like, it depends where they're working. To take mining, for instance, there is major and manufacturing, there is major shutdown maintenance things. They're done by contractors usually. They're specialists. So this is not an anti-contractor argument. In some situations, contractors are the way to go because they have the specialist expertise. But in many situations where they're engaged in production or they're fly in, fly out, drive in, drive out, they're precarious as well. They labour hire, they can be removed off site without any reason, so they therefore will not report health and safety problems. So all of those issues combine with the economic pressure on them. I mean, labour hire workers in a number of industries, including mining. I mean, the wage difference was incredible. It was $30,000 less a year. So these were massive differences, which again, the new IR legislation has addressed through the same job, same pay principle. So, yeah, that's the sort of problems you're dealing with. That you're like, these sorts of breakdowns in communication and people being pressured can happen in any workplace, but where you've got contractors, it's more likely, and where you've got more contractors, it's even more likely.
Yeah, so how can we surface some of those concerns and those weak signals?
Well, companies could do more effective risk assessments and strategic decisions making about when they use contractors and when they don't. And so they could say, yes, they do important work here. We can control that. They know what they're doing, and we're going to pay them a price that means they'll do the job properly. So, you can screw down the price, but eventually there's a trade-off. But this other area, no, we're better off with direct hire employees. And interestingly, in some mines, not all, with the change in rates of pay, some mines have gone back to using fewer contractors. So those sort of decisions need to be made strategically, but very few companies do it. There's a battery of consultants on supply chains and that trying to convince you to use more and more outsourcing, that this is the way, and don't worry about COVID. We've got new resilient systems that will deal with that, which is, of course, a crock of you know what. And there's an industry of it, you know. So we can do it, and governments need to send clear signals, and unions need to get active about it too, and some are. You know, they're very active in this space. So there's been a number of outsourcing. And indeed, privatisation, which was often linked to outsourcing, there's been a bit of a reversal because it didn't deliver and never was going to deliver what it was. Health and safety, people said from the start, this will lead to a diminution of health and safety. They were very evasive when you said with private, oh, it's going to save money. We're going to pay really cheaper prices. And they said, well, it's going to be more efficient. They wouldn't give a cast iron guarantee that would lead to cheaper prices. And we've all seen that it hasn't. It's led to a less regulated situation. I mean, the bat situation following the financial crisis was a clear example of the problems. Idea of installing bats in roofs to give work following the financial crisis around 2008, great idea, but don't privatise it because that was just asking for trouble. Same with the NSDIS, a contracted out system, doomed to failure, doomed to not work efficiently, and that we're seeing the consequences of that.